Throughout history, there have been countless unexplainable stories, events, and moments captured on audio. These horrifying tapes were archived, never to be heard again. Until now. These are the tapes of trepidation. Tape number 6. Have you ever heard of a Skinwalker? I've avoided telling this story before because I want to believe that it wasn't real, that it was just a dream. But I've read so many similar encounters that I feel like maybe I should tell someone. Maybe it was real, and something like this really lives out there. I wish I'd known it was possible back then. The story starts at my aunt's house. At the time, my mother and father were going through a divorce. I was about 11, and my younger sister was only 6. The details of the divorce don't really matter, but we were staying at my aunt's house with my mom until she could find a place she could afford on her own. My sister and I were too young to fully understand, so it was almost like a vacation. It helped that my aunt had a really cool house. It was big and seemed even bigger to a couple of kids. I don't really know house lingo, but it was very modern, with 2 long main wings. One side housed the bedrooms and a small library, and the other side had the kitchen. The kitchen had these huge windows, the kind lots of more modern style houses have, where they take up the whole wall. Nestled in this wall of windows was a sliding glass door. My sister and I rarely used it because it was large and heavy and hard for us to open. Another thing about these windows, though, was that they faced the woods. My aunt's house was surrounded, right on the edge of a large wooded area. The trees ended only a couple feet away from where the sliding glass door was. Of course, this was one of the benefits of her house. Living near the woods was peaceful. Or at least, that's what my aunt always said. My aunt had a small sitting area by the windows where she could watch nature. She told us that oftentimes she'd have little herds of deer walk through, and that she'd even seen a mountain lion once. Anyway, you get the idea. It was a big house with big windows, and it sat close to the woods. For the majority of the time that we lived there, we had no issue. My sister and I would even go play in the woods, always staying inside of the house. My mother would often sit in the sitting area by the windows and keep an eye on us. We'd play hide and seek or tag, or see if we could climb the trees. Things changed at night, though. I hated those windows at night. When I'd walk down the hall to the south wing of the house to get a glass of water from the kitchen, I'd always see the trees moving, swaying unnaturally. Not like from wind, where it started from the top and worked its way down, but like something was pushing against them from below, and the trees shook from that. It freaked me out. But I was 11, so it wasn't that hard. I'd usually just hurry up and get my water and run back to my room. I hated it so much that I rarely forgot to get water before bed after the first couple of times. Wasn't risking that creepy shit again. Later on, I wasn't given a choice though. One night, I had a dream that my mother was calling me.
Sweetie, can you come help me?
Her voice was coming from the kitchen asking for my help with something. I stood up from my bed and made my way towards where she called. My brain fuzzy from sleep. Her voice was soft, but it carried to me as I walked, warm and familiar. The closer I got, though, the weirder it sounded, becoming slightly distorted and deeper. It was like a mix of my mother's voice with some animalistic cries that just got louder until I was shocked awake just before I stepped through the doorway into the kitchen. I quickly looked around, confused. My mom wasn't there, and the whole house was dark, except for the moonlight that illuminated just enough of the room for me to know it was empty. I shrugged it off as a sleepwalking dream, though I'd never had one before. So I turned around and walked back to my room. A few nights passed before it happened again. This time, it was my father who called me.
Please,
He called,
I need to talk to you. Come here.
and just like last time, I stood up from my bed, like in a trance, aware and unaware of what I was doing. Each step brought me closer to the kitchen, where I could hear my father,
Come on. I gotta talk
his
to you.
voice becoming more gravelly
Come on.
and broken as I walked.
Gotta talk to you.
I stepped into the kitchen and thought I saw him there, standing by the kitchen island, illuminated in the moonlight. Then he turned and looked at me, and I woke up, realizing there was nothing there after all. Took a few days again, but on the third night, I heard my little sister. She was crying for me, telling me she hurt herself in need of my help. I stood up and started hurrying to the kitchen, ever the big brother. This time, I barely noticed when her voice started changing, becoming a distorted gasp as I drew closer. I stepped into the kitchen and saw her. She was knelt, crying on the ground near the windows. I started to walk over to her, but stopped when I realized something. She was kneeling behind the glass. She was outside. Her cries became a laugh, and I startled awake. But I still saw a shape kneeling just outside the window. Only it was bigger and dark and misshaped. I screamed in terror and it moved. Faster than anything I'd seen before, disappearing into the woods. My mother came running from her room, turning on the lights and comforting me. I told her about the sleepwalking in passing, so she chalked it up to me still having been asleep when I told her about the monster. She walked me back to my room and had me take some sleeping medicine to help me get back to sleep. After that, everything seemed like it might be okay. A week passed, and then two. My mom found a nice apartment that she planned to move us into. My sister and I were sad to leave, but I was secretly relieved. I'd been on edge every night since it happened, wondering if it would call to me again. But everything was silent until the night before we were meant to leave. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard a shuffling outside my door. I froze, certain that the monster had returned for me, that it had somehow gotten in the house and was about to open my door. But the sound simply moved past me and down the hallway towards the kitchen. I stayed where I was, waiting to make sure it wasn't a trick, then got up as quietly as I could and crept over to the door. I hovered, unsure if I should open it. After a few seconds, I made up my mind to run to my mom's room and wake her up. I slowly cracked open the door and peeked into the hallway towards where the sound was coming from. There, at the end of the hallway, shuffling into the kitchen, was the form of my little sister. I blinked, and then squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again, making sure I wasn't asleep. But no, she was real, and she was disappearing into the kitchen, right before my eyes. As I realized this, I realized I could hear something. A kind of faraway moaning whine coming from the direction she was going. Dread ran up my body, and I looked down the hallway at my mom's door, the opposite direction that my sister was walking. Fear told me to run and get her first, but instinct moved my feet towards the kitchen, where my sister had gone out of sight. I ran as silently as I could down the hall and peered around the doorway to look for her. There she was. She was standing right in front of the window. Her eyes opened but glazed. As I watched, I realized the trees were swaying. The same thing they used to do, but much faster now. The swaying seemed to be getting closer, moving towards us at an alarming speed. I could hear branches breaking and the trees creak in protest as something hit them. And the moaning whine I had heard from far away was getting louder, sounding like a dying animal. One tree was rocked so violently a flock of birds flew screaming out of it into the night air. As this was happening, my sister was reaching for something. The lock on the sliding door. Even at 11, I knew something was coming through the woods towards us. And it was running, sprinting, right at my sister. I ignored my brain screaming at me to run the other way and race towards my sister. The noise was all-encompassing now. It had become a screeching so loud that it sounded like it was all around me. I grabbed my sister from around the waist, pulling her back just before her fingers touched the lock, and I pulled both of us behind the wall beside the windows, just out of sight. The sound stopped. The trees no longer swayed. and the screeching had fallen silent. I could hear my sister breathing frantically, but I had to hold her mouth closed, willing her not to cry. My own breathing was shallow and fast, but as I tried to quiet it, I realized there was another sound. My sister's breathing, my breathing, and the even breathing of someone, something else, standing just outside the window next to us. A too large humanoid shadow blocked the moonlight that usually fell into the kitchen, and I watched the creature reach out its unnaturally long arm. I held my breath as I heard a scratch against the sliding door and saw the shadow of the creature's arm touch where the door was. After a second, the creature withdrew its arm and let it fall to its side. Then stood there, still, for what felt like hours. Finally, the shadow shrunk, and I could hear whatever it was leave. The underbrush rustled and the trees swayed, but the sound moved away this time, instead of towards us. Still, I didn't move. I waited until all traces of its presence was gone before I slowly pulled my sister toward the hall, keeping out of sight of the windows as much as I could. My sister was crying as I led her down the hall. I think I was squeezing her hand too tight, but I felt an overwhelming relief as I opened the door to my mother's room and crawled into her bed. My mother never believed us, of course, and we moved away the next day. I refused to return to my aunt's house ever since, and she eventually moved away. I've never had an encounter like that again. That might be because I stay away from the woods like a plague now. And if you're a fan of hiking or camping or living near nature, all I can say to you is good luck. This has been tape number 6 by the Tapes of Trepidation Horror Narration Podcast. Have You Ever Heard of a Skinwalker? Was written by Reddit user Lilithmaynot. It was originally posted on Reddit No Sleep. Narration, production, and sound design was by TJ Hodder. Additional voices for this episode were provided by Liliana Roman. The Tapes of Trepidation theme was written by the incredible J.M. Scherf. All logos, banners, overlays, and graphic design work was provided by the talented Jason Reese from Jaybird Digital Arts. If you have a story you would like to submit or a question regarding the show, please contact us at tapesoftrepidationpodcast@gmail.com. All content used on Tapes of Trepidation is either original, used with permission, or is available under Creative Commons license. All rights reserved unless otherwise stated. This podcast and its content may not be redistributed or rebroadcasted without the express written consent of Tapes of Trepidation and the story's author. Thank you so much for listening.